this afternoon. I'm actually also a graduate of MCPS, a proud graduate of Montgomery Blair High School, and happy to be joining everyone on this panel today. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us, Maritza. I'll turn next to Linsey Malig-Mayhew.
Hi, everyone. Also very excited to be here. I am Linsey Malig-Mayhew. I'm currently a public policy fellow at the DC Deputy Mayor's Office for Education, but also a former MCPS educator. I taught ESOL and I taught special education at Wheaton, Einstein, and Springbrook. So I got around the county a little bit, but I've also taught in DC, Maryland, or DC, Virginia, and on the West Coast as a special educator, and I've done some LGBTQ youth advocacy work. So bringing a lot of different perspectives into the conversation, and happy to be in Montgomery County, live in Silver Spring. So any Silver Spring fans, hit me up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Linsey, for joining us this evening. And next, I will turn to Sebastian Johnson.
Thank you, Delegate. Thank you, Strong Future Maryland and Lee, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Another proud graduate of Montgomery Blair High School. I live in Montgomery County, love Montgomery County. Had the pleasure of serving as student member on the board in 2006. Not to date myself, and ran for school board in 2016. Proud Lee member. I completed the Teach for America Corps in Lawrence, Massachusetts as a third grade teacher, and really honored to serve on the Strong Future Maryland Advisory Board. Thank you guys for having me.
And last but certainly not least, we are joined by a current MCPS high school student who was just coming, I understand, from an award ceremony, hopefully receiving an award. So go ahead and introduce yourself, Jeniffer.
Hi, my name is Jeniffer Ventura, and I am a senior at James Hoover Blake High School. I am very excited to be seeing all of you and talking to all of you about my experience. And yes, I did receive a lot of awards. Not to brag, but look, a plaque upside down. I got a plaque with my name. Very excited. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. So to the audience members, first of all, we've got some prepared questions that we're going to work our way through and chat a little bit about. But, you know, of course, there is room in the chat for you to post questions you're interested in. You can do it if you're here with us on Zoom. If you're joining us on the Facebook stream, you can do it in the Facebook comments. We encourage you to do that. We will try to get to as many questions as we can before 6 p.m. when we're going to cut off the live stream. But we'll start with the 800-pound gorilla in the room of educational policy right now, which is the fact that we are now starting to come out, thankfully, of the COVID pandemic, but we have a lot of work to do to help our students get back to normal and recover from any learning loss. So my first question to the panelists, now that kids are starting to come back into classrooms, what's our priority? What do we need to focus on as we recover? Are there measurable targets for student learning that we need to be looking at?
I think we definitely, as a current student, I think we definitely need to adjust back to in-person school, because a lot of our schedule has been like very flexible. And then we're going back to school where it's very rigid and we have this schedule and we have to be in a certain place and everything. When we were in home, we could just really go get water, or we could just go watch, be in class from our sofa. So it's like that adjustment to a classroom setting to staying in a room, in a bedroom, it changes the dynamic. So I think we need to like adjust a little bit, have like a little bit more breaks than we usually do for students that are in person. Definitely that.
Linsey, go right ahead.
Yeah.
You beat Sebastian.
Fast on that button. I totally agree with Jen and want to support and lift up what she's saying. I also do some instructional coaching with teachers in the region, and that's something that I've heard a lot from them, which is what can we do to bring some of the comfort and safety that students who did experience that in virtual learning in their home environments into our classrooms. And so just kind of reimagining our behavior management systems and our schedules. You know, we don't need to go back to the same. We can go with the whole build back better idea. And with that, I also wanted to lift up the whole idea of the scope and sequence of our curriculum, not also going back to just the same way we did that before as well, and focus a little bit more on prioritizing standards through vertical planning. The schools that I've heard that have done that have been more successful this year. And that's kind of helped with the stress that teachers experience trying to get everything in, and you know, we got to test all these standards. You know, if we can reimagine just our scope and sequence of our curriculum as well as the environment, I think that'll make that transition a lot easier for both teachers and students.
That's a great point. Sebastian, did you have something to add too?
Yeah, I think it's probably my bias as a former third grade educator, but I think that, you know, reading comprehension, particularly for our younger students who missed a year of really critical reading instruction, that will cascade and have impacts or implications on everything from, you know, STEM subjects, behavior, so many different things come back to you know, early reading levels. And so we'd love to see a focus on small group tutoring and other efforts to make sure that kids who have lost those critical years of reading instruction are not left behind as they go from learning to read to reading to learn. And then, you know, just to piggyback on what Jen said, I think that if COVID has shown us anything, it's that there are some really massive disparities in our community by socioeconomic status, by race, but also in access, you know, in the experience of the pandemic. I think there is a lot of lingering trauma, a lot of mental health issues that students and teachers and really everyone, you know, once you're out of that trauma or that period of heightened stress, you know, I was reading an article in the, I think it was in the Times, that said like your first breath, your first exhale can often be a sigh. And so you're like, why is all of this grief and all of this trauma coming now when we should be able to put it behind us? And I think that is part of the resilience of humans, is that there will be this overhang. And so really want to make sure we're supporting students and staff with adequate access to mental health services, increasing the number of counselors and psychologists, and of course, really making sure that our behavioral policies, as Linsey mentioned, reflect you know, everything that we've gone through.
Yeah, I was gonna add to the factor of engaging whole families, right, in this process of re-entering school buildings, and because one of the learnings I think for many of us doing this work is that students don't have a separate life necessarily at school, right? There, everything that happens outside of the classroom impacts their ability to work in our classrooms, to learn. And so I just noticed a question, what supports need to be in place in classrooms, right? I think it's also a deeper understanding of sort of the social emotional needs of students, having groups or teams that can assess those different needs and solutions that could be given to our students and their families, and also take the onerous sometimes away from teachers being the only ones who can provide, who have to do all the assessments, right? They have to assess for social emotional needs, for mental health, for so how do we also create sort of these wellness type of teams in schools that can help us bridge the school home gap that exists in so many of our schools.
Well, let's focus in on that question a little bit, because these are great points on, I think, on social and emotional learning and the family relationship. So you know, I think Sebastian's right. COVID pulled back the curtain on a lot of things that we weren't talking about enough, right, and focusing on enough. And one of them is this issue of social emotional support that we haven't been providing to kids for decades. So what are you seeing in schools right now? Are we doing more on social emotional support for students? If not, what do we need to do? What does that support look like over the next year, 2 years, 5 years?
I'd like to talk out of experience. So I have a history of anxiety. So I get a little anxious sometimes with stuff that happens around me in my environment. And in school, I think teachers notice how I would get very stressed in classroom settings when I miss an assignment or I get or B or lower. So I would get very stressed and anxious about the situation. So they noticed that and they recommended me to take these small little groups. And we would take like 30 minutes out of a class day, and they would take me into this like little conference room area where it'd be like 6 students, and we would all talk about how our days has been and how we can take like mindful like ways to like kind of like understand our emotions and kind of like just relax and understand ourselves to just understand our emotions, what we were feeling, and to validate them because they were perfectly fine to feel those emotions and ways to cope with those emotions.
I think part of it is finding is also giving schools an array of solutions, right? It doesn't have to look like the same way for all schools, right? But having that team who's able to dig into the data, right? Dig into what they're seeing and what families are reporting or students are reporting, and create a plan of action for each family. I think what we've seen is a lot of families, depending on what school a child goes to, getting certain services while others don't get certain services. And so what we need to sort of do, I feel like as a system, is really an analysis of what are the services available, what's going on in each school, and does it meet sort of these target goals that a school may have around social emotional health, right? Or social emotional factors and things of that sort. So really ensuring that people have accessible points with which they can enter into getting those programs or solutions that they may need.
Linsey, I saw you pop off your mic for a second there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally support that point, Maritza, because I think in order for us to really establish equitable services and supports for mental health, there needs to be a system-wide approach, whether that is, doing an audit of what exists right now, or here's your menu of options that are evidence-based that a school can choose from. I think that needs to be coordinated at the district level for both service delivery and integrating how we're integrating SEL into both the classrooms and whole schools. One example of how that could be done is I know there's some school districts in Connecticut that have adopted the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, their SEL curriculum. So that's just one example of how MCPS could go about it. And I wanted to also name a specific MCPS trend that I had experienced in the classroom, and why I left to do advocacy work. Is a huge need. I think it could be summarized in this one example. There was a student, one of my students was arrested on our school campus, and we didn't talk about it with our students. We didn't talk about it as a school. They weren't offered counseling. And when I've taught, in Oakland, when I've taught in DC, I've known who I could go to and what the procedures were for connecting my students to services when they needed them. And I didn't experience that as a teacher in the schools that I was in. That's maybe where the audit comes in, because I'm sure there's schools that teachers do know. But I know that our students didn't get the services they needed, and that was pre-pandemic. And just one last thing I wanted to bring forward is just the unique needs of LGBTQ youth during the pandemic. You know, in our community, we often rely on nonverbal cues to connect with each other, and know who's in our community with us, and a lot of that gets missed virtually. And so sometimes LGBTQ people and youth can feel more isolated in the virtual world. And I know some GSAs have been meeting, but we're all experiencing Zoom fatigue. You know, if it's between like doing another Zoom and going outside and having free time, a lot of students are opting out of those type of things. So I think as we consider mental health needs and returning and recovery, that's just something we need to be aware of and think systematically, how do we make investments of resources, time, and funding in that.
That's a great point. And I would normally at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm an introvert, so I was perfectly no Zoom fatigue here. But now I think even introverts like me are tired of it. So, so great point. So, but we still have, speaking of Zoom and Zoom fatigue, we still have some students who are learning from home, who aren't, seeing their teachers in person every day. How do we make sure that in the remaining time that they're learning from home, that they're getting the support they need from the school system?
I think a lot of investing of like time interaction with student and teacher. Sometimes because it's such an easy place where you can just forget about a student because you're focusing on what you're doing. You're thinking about, let me get on this topic because we have to do this and we have to put this on the test. This is just me talking about like as a senior. Teachers are invested, not teachers, but they're invested in like, let's teach the curriculum, let's teach this. And they're not putting a lot of effort into let's learn about each other. Let's talk about this. Let me give you a little bit of attention, because sometimes it's best to teach individually in some cases, like sometimes a student is having a hard day and they're afraid to ask a teacher, like, can you go over this question again? Because I'm afraid of like what's going on and I don't know what I'm understanding, or is this correct? Am I doing it correctly? So sometimes it's that one-on-one conversations and one-on-one interactions that really help students get through school.
That's great. I mean, it's interesting, like this experience of dealing with COVID, like so many others, reinforces the basics of good teaching. We know that, getting to know your students individually and working with them one-on-one is so important, right? It's just another example of why. Maritza?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jennifer's point of I was also a former teacher in another life, and it was such an important decision to engage your students beyond the curriculum or beyond your classroom, and especially during these times. We saw a great school model, not in Montgomery County, but actually in Prince George's County, of a school that every student has an advisor. Those advisors created a wellness sort of survey for their students. And they were actually the ones calling home to survey all of their advisees to make sure that they were getting things like, food on the table, that they weren't having rental issues, right? But that they were also like connecting online, right? Making sure that they were getting the materials and resources they needed to be successful academically. It was through that survey, though, that they were also able to pinpoint the students who were having the greatest challenges, and realize that, in the ecosystem of each child, right, like we had students who weren't connecting, and it was because they were lacking food at home or needed to add income to their households, right, to be able to pay for rent. And it's just, again, an example of, I think, what can be done by teachers or teams of support staff in our schools and teachers working together to sort of assess the whole child and make sure that they have what they need to be academically successful. But that takes a cultural shift in some ways of the way we're used to doing school. But I think, what Jennifer has shared with us too is that maybe it is a time for us to do a cultural shift in what we do in education and how we educate our students.
not just a cultural shift, but resources and training. Which we'll come back to that point in just a second because I want to circle us back to the blueprint. But Sebastian, I saw you wanted to get a word in.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate. I think that what folks are talking about is the community school model, and not just relying only on the classroom teacher to meet all of the unmet needs that show up in the classroom. And so when we think about the best and most effective way to deliver social and emotional learning supports, when we think about the best way to do family outreach, often those approaches have to be culturally competent, and it has to come from a credible messenger in the community or a peer. And so the better, I think that the school system can do a better job with the county, with the state, of investing in those wraparound services and creating the connections between the groups that are already in the community, that are from the community and represent community, who are doing that outreach work, who have been on the front lines providing mutual aid. How do we bring them into our system to make sure that they're delivering messages, they're increasing uptake of different programming that the school and the system are already offering? And also, how do we bring them in to better support students who are disconnected because of the pandemic?
Putting the community in community schools there, right? Well, so speaking of teachers, I mean, this has been a difficult year for a lot of students. It's also been a difficult year, I think, for a lot of teachers, at least the ones I know, who've been, working harder than ever, and frankly, taking a beating in the press and on social media from people who blame teachers because schools had to close down because of the pandemic. And what can we do for the teaching, for the educator? And I want to expand beyond just teaching because it's every educator in the building that matters, for the education workforce in the moment, and what can we also do longer term to help retain and recruit educators for our classrooms?
I really wanted to talk about this. I think that we should increase the amount of people of color as teachers. I feel that personally, I've been taught by so many by white people and white teachers that I feel like I didn't get the experience I wanted because it didn't resonate with me. A lot of their experiences were experiences that they developed. I have different experiences than they do. In the morning when I wake up to plátanos. I wake up to huevos fritos. I wake up to so many different things than what they do. So I want a teacher that I could resonate with, and I feel like many more younger students, because some people feel ashamed of their culture at some points when they were younger. So they need to embrace their culture, and some teachers can do that. They can bring their culture to their own classroom. So bringing teachers that look like the students will definitely help in the future.
100%. That's a great point. I heard it from my students too when I was teaching. Lindsay?
Yeah, that definitely resonates, Jen. And I think there are some initiatives maybe we'll get to when we talk about the blueprint that support that. I was also thinking that in terms of supporting teachers and what they've gone through in the past year, students are comfortable talking to their teachers. And so teachers become kind of the frontline mental health support for students. And, and I'm sitting in these listening sessions with parents and teachers and students right now. And what we keep hearing is the students are saying, I don't want to go to a school psychologist or, social worker. I don't know them. And so that's why I think we really need that culture shift that was discussed earlier. It needs to bring teachers into the mental health planning and training, but also bring the service providers into the classrooms and figuring out capacity so they can build those relationships with the students so that they're more comfortable coming to them. Because otherwise, the stress that teachers experience, having to carry all of that, and it feels like it's by yourself, is going to continue to lead to burnout and teacher retention issues.
Absolutely. Retention issues, which have only been getting worse over the last few years, right? And to Jen's point, retention issues that are worse among educators of color than white educators. So I mean, all great points. Well, so one of the good things that's happening right now is there's an unprecedented amount of money heading for our school system right now and heading for schools, in part because of the state's blueprint funding, but in part also because of federal funding under the American Rescue Plan. So let's talk a little bit about that funding. You know, to the extent that some of it I know is already under state and federal law allocated to specific programs, some of it's more flexible. Where's that money headed, and the money that's more flexible, where should it be headed? And let's chat about that for a second.
Dr. Luedtke, that is a great question, because there is still a lot we feel like can be done from school systems to let us know also, and our state Department of Education to let us know what sort of guidance is being provided to ensure that that money lands in the right place, right? It is this huge amount of money that's very flexible in some ways, but also requires, I think, a lot more accountability and transparency that school districts need to give us, right? And, you know, we've been asking, for example, for accurate plans from school like MCPS to sort of share what they will be designating those funds to. And I know it's very tedious, right, to read and to read a budget plan, let alone put one together. But it is absolutely necessary as we move forward. We know that already, you know, there's a ton of money being given to organizations that are doing sort of summer learning recovery programs, and not necessarily tied to input from communities or impacted folks. And so we do want to make sure that as we move forward, that accountability and transparency is there for those plans.
What happens? So I think we're getting something in the range of $250 million from the American Rescue Plan. What happens when that money's gone? Because that's not an ongoing funding commitment from the federal government, right? What should we be thinking about in terms of that potential quote unquote funding cliff that may be approaching once we spend that money?
Yeah, one of the things that I spend a lot of time in my day job thinking about is how can you use the influx of federal and public dollars to secure philanthropic dollars, private donations, to really start to seed some new ways of thinking and ways of doing things. You know, one of those things I think is kind of small group tutoring, bringing an influx of folks who have a background either in education or who are interested in that field, bringing them into classrooms, having those mentors provide culturally competent in-person tutoring during the school day. So I think that there are ways that you can start to think about how do we use these funds to, number one, meet the unfilled needs that are immediate, but also to experiment in ways that show promise that can then be the hook for continued public funding because you've demonstrated success in the way that things work. So how to use those dollars to leverage philanthropic dollars should be one that our leaders are thinking about.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, I'll tell you, that's what keeps me up at night about this stuff because we've seen so many times, you know, new innovative programs come in and they do great things for a couple of years. And then the funding runs out. And then the school systems retrench and the state governments don't invest and we lose those lessons, right? So, Maritza?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to be clear about is that, and especially in relation to the blueprint, is that, you know, the American Rescue Plan dollars does not replace the promise made to us by the blueprint, right? And I think one of the great things, though, is that some of the priorities of how that federal money can be spent align with some of the blueprint priorities and kind of gives you a jump start or an added sort of bonus, right, in terms of filling the inequities that we've seen, right? Whether it's diversifying our teacher pipelines, even to, to a certain extent, improving infrastructure for some of our schools, which we know have been some key issues, right? And challenges, but it should never be replaced. To also add to Sebastian's point, I think we also need to figure out how, in this community schools kind of model, how do we integrate all these organizations that could be potentially filling in these equity gaps, right? From things like registering families to go to school, right, to mental health services, and think of how we use that money to more globally incorporate all the different community partners that we have or that our families interact with on their day-to-day, right? We know that a child not just gets services from schools, but actually goes to organizations like CASA or Catholic Charities or all these other organizations in our ecosystem. And so are we also incorporating them into our plans of how best to use this money as well?
Just so, and to that point, I mean, I think that really what we have seen in this year is just the deep, stunning inequities by race and by socioeconomic status in our community and communities across the country. And so, Delegate Luedtke, to your point, an influx of dollars is never going to solve the issue of housing segregation, school segregation, concentrated need within certain pockets of the community. And that's a policy choice that we continue to make at the local and the state and the federal level. And so I think part of this rethink of how we reallocate our resources has to be about, how we finally tackle the issue of segregation as well, because I think that all of the things that we're trying to fix are downstream of that.
Mm-hmm. Or, can we try to address the issue of segregation at all? Can we do anything about it? Because we haven't been for decades. So what then Sebastian, how would you do it? How do we start addressing that? If now's the moment, if the curtain's been pulled back and we have this, I mean, first of all, this moment nationally where racial equity is really at the top of the political agenda, right? Where do we start in reducing segregation?
I mean, I think part of that is addressing, inequities in land use, or where you're allowed to build certain kind of housing within the county. Most people, I live in a townhouse now. I grew up in an apartment in Tacoma Park. I cannot afford to buy a single family home in Tacoma Park today. So making it so that teachers can live in the communities where they teach, that families can afford to live in any community where there are good schools, and there should be good schools in every community. I also think that the state and the federal government can do a better job by tying funding to racial desegregation within our schools and within our neighborhoods. I think that local boards of education and counties are a creation of the state, and so I don't think that it is unfair or that it would be outside of the purview of the legislature or the governor to think about how do we make sure that our state dollars are going to support the policies that we want to see around desegregation, around integration of our schools and our communities.
We had a great question in the chat related to this, which is MCPS specific. So MCPS just published its boundary study, which, as we all know, some of the conversations around the boundary study were very controversial and frankly, revealed some feelings in the community that a lot of people like to pretend weren't here in Montgomery County. So what do you all think about the boundary study? What should be the next steps there? $1 million question.
I kind of, it's hard for me because I think I'm a true believer in education, public education especially. I don't think that, I think to Sebastian's point of, there are these so many other factors that contribute to segregation, right? And until those are kind of solved, we'll continue to see some of the issues and challenges that communities of color especially have faced. But I also think we have to make sure that every single student, regardless of where they live, have access to a quality education, right? And that to me is equity, right? Is ensuring, regardless of whether they live in, the Long Branch neighborhood in Montgomery County, or they live in, in Bethesda, right? That they're able to access a quality education that has the resources and programs that they need and deserve, right? That we shouldn't have to tie it to the zip code they're in, or the PTA that runs their school, right? But actually, that these are factors that, like, as a school system, we're also thinking about, right? And doing that assessment of, like, so why does, a Rolling Terrace only have these types of programs, right? Instead of, why does a school somewhere else have, astronomy club and all of these other things, but we're only doing these basic social services at, like, a Rolling Terrace, right? Like, or things of that sort, right? Because I think it's also sort of the system's responsibility to do that assessment and be able to provide, right, the resources and supports that every student needs to succeed, and not just succeed, but to thrive, right? And it shouldn't be dependent on where a student lives. So I feel kind of mildly optimistic about what can come out of the boundary study, and what the implementation can be of those changes. Because if we don't have a cultural shift in how we see public education, right, and who deserves what, then I don't think, you can bus children all over the place, right? Or you can change the boundaries, but if those fundamental ideas aren't changed, then I don't think we would see any sort of change.
I wanted to give kind of like an anecdote about what's happening with basically around my community where I am right now. I live in White Oak, and my neighbor also lives in White Oak, but she goes to Springbrook and I go to Blake. Springbrook is a very predominant African American and Hispanic school. So and it has a lot of low income students and a lot of immigrants that come to this school. And the school that I go to, it's a very has a mixture of lower income students, like myself and a lot of the students where I live, and also a mix of students that come from like middle class areas and Only and Ashton and all that area. So and what I found out recently is that kids from Springbrook are getting bagged at their school. Like, they check their bags to see if they're like carrying weapons, or if they're like checking that. And personally, I've never gone through that, but I feel like that's kind of not great, to feel like they're going to check your bags just because you're a student there. And that shouldn't be the case. They should trust their students, And I think it's mostly due to the fact because they're living in these areas, And in my school, it's a very nice school and everything. And we don't get that issue, We don't get bagged. And I feel like there's such a disparity between clubs that I have at my school and the clubs that they have at Springbrook,
I just wanted to call out. Oh, sorry, Linsey, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I've also noticed what Jen is talking about, having taught at Springbrook, and how the teachers and students kind of view themselves in relation to some of the other areas and schools in the county. And it's because of that, and what others have mentioned, just with the concentration of resources that are tied to geographic space in the county. With the boundary study, which I have to admit I have not read, but if it does not include a racial equity impact analysis or assessment, I hope that that's something that can be considered for the future. And something else that I think could help is doing an audit of PTAs and PTOs, and how they are contributing to school budgets, so that we can look at, okay, if PTAs and PTOs are going to be supplementing budgets in certain areas, maybe we need to boost budgets in other areas. There's a bill that's being discussed in DC that does an audit of PTAs and PTOs that I think could really benefit Montgomery County as well. So those are, I think, some things that could be companions to the boundary study to help with our issues of not only segregation, but just concentration of both poverty and concentration of wealth that we see tied to geography in our county.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have to say that, and even I think what's hard for me is that some of the things that Jen talks about, I was seeing. I graduated from high school 21 years ago, and it was the same issues, right? So you also have to begin to ask yourself, what within our system continues to perpetuate some of the stereotypes, racial inequity issues that we have, right? And what can we do to change those attitudes, really, and those behaviors, right, that have existed around how we treat certain groups of students in our county, and how we bolster those schools, right? Like and that assessment piece, I think, has been a hard one for our school system, unfortunately, to want to take a deeper dive into looking at themselves, right? Because for so long, we've been, always considered the best in the state, right? The best in the country in terms of the school system, without necessarily looking at these smaller issues that continue to persist and impact students academically.
And I just wanted to call out the solution that Laura put in the chat here, which is to do holistic. I think even just looking at this holistic boundary analysis has shown, one, how it has been a lot harder for it to be a small conversation about these two communities and this one boundary that kind of gets lost in the mix. There's been so much activism from students, from identity, from the NAACP, from parent organizations around the values that they want to animate the changing of boundaries. And I think having a holistic, independent commission that is looking at it periodically, every 5 to 10 years, is a much better approach than doing boundary studies within cluster periodically and having it get lost.
It's always, Sebastian, I agree 100%. It's always surprised me that we leave it up to politicians, because just inherently a politician has a constituency that's going to reelect them or not. And, if you have a boundary study that's where you've got a community that's more privileged and less privileged, which community is going to have more political influence? It's going to be, by definition, the community with more privilege. So it makes these types of changes nigh impossible. So, well, we are, I mean, this is a great conversation, but we are starting to run short of time. So I'm going to go around and ask each of our 4 panelists to respond a little bit to some closing questions. And if you want to add your own closing thoughts as well, now would be the time. So we're hopefully heading to a new normal, and emphasis on both of those words: more normal than COVID, but new, right, with some change. So what should change in that new normal, and what should we bring back from the world a couple decades ago before COVID? What is our collective responsibility as educators and advocates in advocating for education going forward? I'll just go in the same order that I introduced people, or that I called on people to introduce themselves in. So that means, Maritza, you're on you're up first.
I think really, for me, the takeaway and what I hope continues is the increased engagement with a wide array of partners in ensuring that our families survived, right, this pandemic, and learning from that experience that, like, a school system alone can't do something, right, or can't fix an issue, but needs the additional support from local trusted organizations that our families turn to when in need. And also, I think, to the point of remembering that that the students that we have in our classrooms, right, are these whole beings who experience life in different ways, and what are we going to do to ensure that they are guaranteed a successful school experience, is one that I think is the key takeaway for myself. So that also requires us as not just to work as a school system alone, maybe, but also to think of new innovative ways of, social agencies, county council, right? How do we all work together to ensure that the resources and supports we can have available are thought about comprehensively and accessed comprehensively by our families.
All right, Linsey.
Yeah, I should have gone first because Maritza took a lot of my stuff. But I can't reiterate enough the importance of coming back to education. I mean, we've been doing school, right? But when we think about this idea of like reopening and returning, what are we returning to? In that context, I think it is so important to carry on the lessons that we have learned, to actually apply those. And what Maritza said with, the person first, like we show up with needs, students, teachers, families. We can't forget that. I mean, that is my greatest hope, that we can't forget that. And that as full human beings, not just people who have to like teach to a test or take a test, my hope is that the needs that are considered are ones that have surfaced over the last year, our social emotional needs. We can't ignore that. The needs that are coming forward with racial equity and justice work, we cannot ignore that either. That's part of what we all bring to school, and it needs to stop being something that's silenced and avoided, and it needs to come to the forefront. And I also want to reiterate the innovation and flexibility that virtual learning has provided. I really hope continues into whatever we return to, because some students have thrived. Specifically, students with special needs who don't need intensive services have really benefited from being able to get more one-on-one attention and the self-paced learning. So my hope is that we can really apply the lessons learned and not try to just go back to normal.
Great. All right, Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those were both the comments I was going to say, particularly around wanting to preserve flexibility in the system. I do think, in some ways, that it does take more planning and more staff to provide flexibility, but I think it is worth it at the end of the day in terms of the outcomes that you'll see. I also think, to the point that Maritza made, thinking about how schools can be hubs for outside organizations and for wraparound services in ways that are integrated into the school day, but also meeting the holistic needs of children and families.
All right. And because student voices should always be centered in our conversations about education, Jen, you get the final word. What are your thoughts?
I think we should continue the sense of community that we felt before the pandemic. I think that that's the most important. I definitely feel like I love how we used to just go have events, and we used to feel one another. We felt like the connection with one another. It wasn't just virtual. It wasn't just like you see my body expression. You actually felt like the presence of someone, and you used to feel happy just talking to someone or talking to the teacher and to asking them, how is my student doing? Like, how's my daughter doing? How's my son doing in the classroom or stuff like that? I really loved that before the pandemic. But I would like to fix the racial disparities, the racial and socioeconomic disparities that students face in the school system. We need to work better to bring equity to our school system, because my education should have the same value as someone who has someone who went to a higher socioeconomic area. we should all have the same opportunities. And I think that should be granted to every student regardless, you know?
Here, here. Jen Ventura for President of the United States. I agree completely. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you again to Strong Future Maryland and Leadership for Educational Equity for sponsoring this. And thank you to everyone who joined us on the live stream. I hope you have a wonderful evening.